For more than 3 centuries, Western media depicted Africa as a continent adrift from civilization as they defined it. Reporters describe it as dark, indifferent to culture, and savage. To business conditioned by this view, Africa was a continent to be exploited for its metals, petroleum, and other materials that fueled industrialization in the West. That view persisted into the 21st century as Africa prepared to host the World Cup of Soccer, the premier sporting event on the globe. The West, long conditioned to seeing danger lurking everywhere in Africa, saw a country that was far from the mythology they promoted.
Everyone thought that the World Cup would fail, that the unions would strike and paralyze transportation, that the power plants wouldn't be able to generate enough electricity. You have power blackouts and brownouts and power failures, and that South Africa really couldn't manage, couldn't organize, couldn't properly host an international event like that.
But why is there this apprehension from Westerners towards South Africa, which is yet one of the leading economies on the African continent?
The negative image of Africa and Africans was built up in parallel, first of all, to slavery and the slave trade. So those images were established in Europe, in the United States, to justify slavery, to justify the slave trade. And then later to justify colonialism, to justify segregation.
L'information a une valeur marchande. Et il est évident que l'on vendra aux consommateurs l'information qui correspond à son conditionnement psychologique.
How is the coverage going to be? Those are the questions you ask yourself, even before the World Cup. And personally, it was not surprising when I started seeing the focus of the coverage in most of the Western media, American publications and British publications. And in many cases, when it comes to Africa, US media outlets take their cue, they take their signal from British media, such as the BBC and many of the newspapers owned by Rupert Murdoch. And then all other U.S. media outlets take their cue from the New York Times. So most of the stories, initial stories were, the high crime rate in South Africa. So many articles were questioning how South Africa was being allowed to host the World Cup.
The entire history of the world for the past 500 years has built up an inequality, which is structured by race. And ideas of the Western countries as a whole, and indeed ideas worldwide, are structured by that power, that racial hierarchy that got established by the conquest, the slave trade, colonialism. So that you actually have worldwide, and I think not just in America, but even extending to Russia or China, ideas of inferiority of black people.
The other issue was, would there be enough facilities, modern facilities?
What are the facts? The facts are that South Africa has hosted a successful World Cup rugby, World Cup of cricket in 2 different forms, in the 50-over version in the 2020. Our capacity as a nation to host big international events had been tested long before we were awarded the World Cup.
Some of the reporting has been way too negative, without people really having a sense of what the country and the continent is really about.
The worst one was an article published in one of the UK papers. Tourists coming to South Africa for the World Cup are going to be confronted by this machete-wielding, angry thugs who will cut them to pieces. And then I read somewhere that, again, to do with England, that there was some powerful poisonous snake that was going to attack the English team. This snake, we were told, has got the potential to kill an entire team. Oh, and then there was the earthquake. There was some threat of an earthquake during the World Cup.
I have to confess that I was very nervous with all the things we read in Brazil about Africa.
They were afraid of not enough security, to get robbed, to get stabbed, to all the bad things that happen in big cities. The reality was that only 2 people were robbed till now, and that was their own fault, I heard.
When I arrived here, it was a good surprise because we didn't see violence, we didn't feel violence.
Just don't go to the places that people say don't go to, but that's the same in my country. When I'm living in Amsterdam, if you go to certain places, you also get robbed or stabbed or whatever. And it's the same with New York, you shouldn't go to the Bronx. So if you just follow what local people tell you, no problem at all.
Security is an issue that we've never really hidden away from. Our country has security challenges like any other country.
Milton Alimadi, publisher of the Black Star newspaper, said that for a long time he has been interested in the tendency of Western media to negatively emphasize events happening on the African continent.
I've always been very disappointed by the Western media representation of the African image, and also the image of people all over the world of African ancestry. I was always intrigued. What was the first interaction between the earliest European people to come from Europe and interact with Africa? What representation did they disseminate to the rest of the world?
The rise of racism in Europe, fueled by descriptions from various visitors to the continent, contributed to these negative images. People would write home about differences. Women danced with men. Women didn't cover their breasts. Men and women engaged in polygyny. Men had multiple wives. All of this went against certain levels of European morality.
I read the writings of the so-called explorers. I call them so-called because these people were very arrogant, coming from Europe, finding places that had inhabitants, finding rivers and lakes and mountains that had names already. And they say they discovered it. Their representation of Africans, either primitive, savage, and they were the earliest ones to set that tone.
Based on these findings, Alimadi, author of the book titled The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa, has cross-analyzed the writings of the first explorers on the continent and the works of the first journalists who covered the African continent.
I started reading the writings of the journalists that were sent by professional newspapers to cover Africa. And here, the earliest ones were from the New York Times. Their earlier depiction was very similar to the writings of the so-called explorers, people like David Livingstone, people like Speke, like Grant, like Burton.
If you're going to analyze what actually comes out in the media, I think you have to look at the various chains of who makes the decisions. One, whether they have reporters on the spot, then what's the mentality of that reporter, but then even more important is who's doing the editing.
So by the time the professional journalists started going in the 1950s to Africa, 1960s, they had already been conditioned to have a certain type of image and expectation from Africa. So for example, when the New York Times sent one of its most famous reporters named Homer Bigart to cover decolonization in Africa, and he was sent to Nigeria and to Ghana. He described the Nigerians and the Ghanaians in the most negative way. They were involved in macabre practices, referred to them as savages, focusing on writing about witch doctors. And the most interesting part of the research was I had the opportunity to go to the New York Times archives. They had files with the personal correspondence of the reporters they sent to Africa, exchanging letters with the editors here in New York. And I'll give you just a few samplings to illustrate. Homer Bigart, for example, he had already won the Pulitzer Prize 2 times before the New York Times sent him to cover independence in Ghana. And he wrote to his editor here, this I believe was in the early 60s, and I have the details in the book, of course. And he wrote and he said, I cannot get enthusiastic about this assignment. He said the leaders remind him of witch doctors that were painted black. And he said, I actually personally prefer cannibalism. And I think this would be a good solution to the population explosion that everybody's complaining about.
In a funny way, they were typical of Homer Bigart. I don't think Homer Bigart was a bigot, but he's being a wise guy. He's saying that that the first era of African leaders were not great men, but up close they were power grabbing and not honest, and that the ordinary people of the country he liked better. I had that feeling when I was in the Congo. I would never have said it that way, but when I covered people like Kasavubu and Chambe and Mobutu, I understood the social context and I understood what was happening, but they were in the main pretty deplorable people.
During his investigations, Ali Mahdi found that it was not only Homer Bigart who had strong stereotypical views about Africa and its people, but the foreign editor did as well.
I found a few instances where the editor, the foreign news editor sitting here in New York, Emmanuel Friedman, wrote to Homer Bigart, and he said, I hope you're doing well in the Badlands. That's how he refers to Africa, the Badlands. He says, by now you've become a Western expert on African witchcraft, African sorcery, African cannibalism. And he says, where else can you read all of this but in the New York Times? So we expect you to keep sending these kind of stories. And sure enough, I then went to the microfilms in the libraries to see what type of stories he sent. And there was a perfect correlation between that distaste for Africa in his private correspondence and the articles that he had published in the New York Times purporting to be journalism. It was not. And I don't just say this as speculating. I continued the research and I was able to confirm this. For example, I found a letter that Bigart had sent to Friedman saying, oh, when he got to what was then Belgian Congo to cover independence, he said he had hoped to find pygmies. So he wanted to interview them. What does independence mean to you? Even though he did not find them, by the time his story was published a few days later in the New York Times, he had found these pygmies. And he said, according to them, independence means now they're going to be able to get more beer, more salt. So this to me showed not only a lack of knowledge about Africa maybe, but it went beyond. This was, there was malicious intention.
It's malicious, but at the time it wasn't thought of as malicious. Homer Bigart was a bigot, okay? If you have a dismissive attitude towards a continent like Africa, and you perhaps secretly think that black people are inferior to white people, even though you can't articulate it, but it's in the way you think. You're going to write pejorative words about what you see in Africa. And Biggert had that mindset, and it's very hard to purge that.
To Joseph Lelyveld, former correspondent and executive editor of the New York Times, it is a dishonor to say that Biggert used disparaging remarks towards Africans.
That Homer Biggert was one of the greatest reporters I ever saw, and I think it's a mistake to make him an example of what's wrong with American journalism in Africa.
Lloyd Garrison, the New York Times senior correspondent for Africa in the 60s, still recalls the struggle he had with his former newspaper about the use of certain stereotypes towards Africans.
I had stories that I wrote from Africa that the copy desk in New York, because they had to shorten the story or they often put into my story cliches such as tribal. I always preferred ethnic.
I know in many African countries, when people use the word tribe, there's a very different connotation. I personally don't favor the word because of the way the meaning and the connotation has been distorted in most of the Western media. You know, I mean, if it's different when you're trying to distinguish yourself, like I'm an Acholi from Uganda, you want to distinguish yourself from a Muganda, coming from different parts of the country, that's different. But when you read it in Western media, tribe, tribalism, tribalistic, it always has a very negative connotation. It gives the image of a people that are intellectually, mentally inferior.
Garrison said he protested the copy desk insertion of the word tribal in his stories, but it was to no avail.
I just happened to be going through a file of letters between myself and my editors, and New York was very, very responsive, but they often didn't always listen. The word, my editor would say, "I understand you," and I've talked to the copy desk and I've told them not to do this, but often the copy desk would still do it.
In 2003, Ali Mahdi published his book, The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa, which was based on the exclusive documents from the New York Times archives. Prior to that, in 1992, he wrote an article about the same subject and tried to get it published. But all the magazines he contacted refused, afraid of offending the New York Times owner. Thereafter, Ali Mahdi decided to take the lead himself.
I sent a copy to the publisher of the New York Times, a copy of my paper, and the managing editor. And they actually wrote back to me, the managing editor, whose name was Joseph Lelyveld. And he said, "I agree that you discovered some very ugly aspects of our coverage of Africa, but I also want to say that it has improved." It's probably true, but that was not the issue I was addressing. I was addressing a broader issue, which is still the Western image of Africa that is very deep-seated. The New York Times has never addressed that. They've never acknowledged, my paper in an adequate way, or the book.
The duty to make corrections, I think, lapses after a certain time. You can't. There's just no way to investigate it. Some scholar can investigate it and make his own conclusions, but the newspaper has to be focused on what happened today or happened recently.
How can you critique the contemporary modern distortions without seeing how it evolved historically?
Quelquefois, n'oubliez pas que les médias sont dans des jeux d'intérêt. Jeux d'intérêt économique, jeux d'intérêt politique et aussi jeux d'intérêt culturel. Et ces jeux-là font que le média, parfois, pour survivre, a besoin d'un minimum de conformité avec son environnement. Autrement, le média aussi peut perdre sa crédibilité, pas en ayant forcément tort, mais seulement en n'ayant pas un rapport de force suffisant pour survivre avec sa vérité. Parce que la vérité aussi, elle ne peut survivre que s'il y a une majorité qui épouse la vérité. Et si vous avez raison en étant seul, c'est comme si vous avez tort. C'est ça le problème.
The past still has an influence on how the Western media writes about Africa. This affected how they covered the 2010 World Cup held in South Africa.
The apocalypse never happened. The mass murders never happened. The mass crime rates never happened.
The country was fascinated by the World Cup. Even the people who indulge in crime seem to have made a patriotic decision to show South Africa as well as they could to the world. It was a great success.
I don't believe that. I believe there had already been an exaggeration. So there was exaggerated expectation.
Not only were Western journalists skeptical about the capability of South Africa to properly host a month-long event, but local journalists shared that feeling too.
Even South African media, it's taken a while for them to realize the magnitude of this event.
The more deeper question is, as Africans, because this is an African World Cup, and a bit of introspection. What other Africans before the World Cup started, did they really think South Africa could do it? And now that the World Cup is over, what their thoughts are.
Bon, je ne crois pas que parce que l'Afrique du Sud a réussi à organiser un mondial que d'autres pays voudront le faire. Pour moi, c'est encore chose. Je suis encore sceptique parce que l'Afrique du Sud a pu, mais qui d'autre pourra encore? Je me pose encore des questions. Et ça sera pour quand encore le tour de l'Afrique? Je me pose toujours des questions parce qu'on n'a pas des gens capables, des dirigeants. Je m'excuse, mais nos dirigeants ne sont pas des hommes capables de décider de quoi que ce soit. On est toujours là en train de tendre la main.
I can see how African journalists can be affected too.
On donne aussi aux Européens une fausse image d'eux-mêmes. On donne à l'Africain une fausse image de lui-même. Mais on donne à l'Européen une fausse image. Mais comme c'est une image positive, au moins ça l'aide à vivre. Hein? Jusqu'à ce que la réalité lui saute à la face. Mais à l'Africain, on intériorise les tares qui sont véhiculés à travers les produits médiatiques. Et on se reconnaît dans ça et on laisse aller. Parce que ça influence et ça façonne la façon d'être des individus.
On peut employer le vocabulaire de Bourdieu. Toutes ces représentations finissent par engendrer des habitus que le journaliste lui-même reproduit. Parfois même inconsciemment.
Ils reprennent par exemple le vocabulaire forgé de manière ironique, de manière méprisante par les Occidentaux pour parler du continent africain. Ils vont vous dire l'homme fort de Lomé, le numéro 1, la junte militaire, etc. Ils épousent la terminologie de l'idéologie occidentale pour dépeindre même l'Afrique, et c'est ça qui est malheureux. Et c'était à eux justement de dépasser la surface des choses pour montrer les jeux d'intérêt qu'il y a derrière les instabilités de nos États, montrer qu'en réalité l'Afrique n'est pas la seule responsable des instabilités et qu'il y a d'autres mains derrière qui agissent et qui favorisent l'instabilité. Malheureusement, très peu de journalistes africains franchissent ce seuil-là.
La plupart d'ailleurs des guerres en Afrique, quand vous les regardez, derrière ces guerres sont instrumentalisées à partir de l'Occident pour des intérêts.
Some of the most critical mineral resources vital to the economic development in the West as well as the non-West come from Africa. I mean, you have to remember the uranium that went into the manufacture of the bombs, the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, that uranium came out of the Katanga province in the Belgian Congo. And the diamonds and the gold that was used to fuel the industrialization of Western Europe at the turn of the last century, much of that came out of South Africa. The Kivu region is a major producer of coltan. Coltan is a mineral that's found in only 4 or 5 places on Earth, and it's absolutely critical in the manufacture of cell phones. And it's those parts of Africa where you had these critical minerals that you find the most conflict today.
La bataille des gens du Sud-Soudan, dans un premier temps, c'était pour un État fédéral unitaire. Celui qui portait ça s'appelait John Garang. On l'a tué. Aujourd'hui, on a travaillé et on travaille à créer 2 États soudanais. Mais c'est simple, on veut simplement faire du Sud une base de l'OTAN et une base américaine. C'est pour ça qu'on a travaillé à créer ce conflit soudanais.
Very few African leaders advocate against Western countries that take advantage of the African countries' abundance of resources.
Unfortunately, it's in the interest of so many countries that do business in Africa and trade with Africa that they want to make sure that the terms of trade and the terms of diplomacy are going to be on their terms, not on Africa's terms. And that will continue until Africa develops a stronger leadership cadre in their own countries.
Où sont les hommes forts qu'on a laissé mener à bout leurs idées pour leur peuple? Où sont-ils?
Sankara, it was a tragic figure. Sankara had the potential, had he not been killed, of being one of Africa's great leaders. He was misunderstood, number one. Number two, I think because there were even people in his own country that wanted to undermine his authority. They wanted to see his end, and they collaborated with outside powers to bring about his end.
Before President Thomas Sankara's assassination during a coup in 1987 in Burkina Faso, Patrice Emery Lumumba from Belgium Congo was also killed in the 60s.
The United States was very nervous about the type of leadership that was emerging in a country like Congo. And they saw someone like Patrice Lumumba, and some of the cold warriors said, "Oh, Lumumba, why, if he comes to power, he'll be a communist. The Congo will become a communist satellite," because Lumumba was obviously an anti-colonialist, and he was talking about possibly larger state involvement in the economy of the Congo. Obviously, an attempt was made and a successful attempt was made to assassinate Patrice Lumumba in 1961. The beginning of 1961, of course, he was assassinated, partly through the collaboration of the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, and Mobutu pledged to be pro-Western, which he remained, and he became a collaborator and ally of the West, particularly the United States.
La politique déteste la naïveté. On ne peut pas faire la politique avec une dose de naïveté. Ça, c'est incompatible. Lumumba, Sankara, ce sont des personnalités qui ont voulu faire la politique comme une école de vertu.
L'Afrique, c'est le continent qui a beaucoup de ressources. Les autres ont consommé une bonne partie de leurs ressources. Donc, il y a cet enjeu-là de vouloir contrôler les ressources. Ça veut dire qu'il faut contrôler aussi les leaders. Donc, nos leaders doivent intégrer ça dans leur démarche. Parce qu'on ne pourra pas contrôler indéfiniment nos leaders quand nos populations seront à un certain niveau d'éducation, quand elles comprendront.
Pour masquer donc toutes ces agressions impérialistes sur l'exploitation de nos ressources minières ou énergétiques, on a besoin de donner une autre image de l'Afrique qui fait de nous des sauvages, qui font de nous des gens qui ne peuvent pas se prendre en charge.
To depict Africa and Africans, Western media shape their views based on their government's policy and consequently spread certain information about some African leaders.
Ce qui est vrai aussi, c'est que il y a un poids particulier que les médias occidentaux ont et que à tel point qu'ils peuvent effectivement changer la figure d'un personnage.
Some have served them extremely well. I mean, like Nelson Mandela is at one extreme, who I think was one of the greatest leaders, world leaders of the 20th century.
Aujourd'hui, à mon avis, il sera le plus grand homme du XXe siècle et aussi le plus grand homme du XXIe siècle. Ce sera le seul homme à pouvoir dominer 2 siècles à la fois.
To make Mandela a public figure internationally was conceived by Anuga Reddy, who's an Indian who is the key UN public official supporting the UN Committee Against Apartheid, in cooperation with people in the ANC, and the anti-apartheid movement in England, developed plans to make Mandela's imprisonment the focus of international public campaign. That would be an example in which the media was affected by a popular movement. And then, once he's released, I think you have to give credit to the individual.
Quand il est arrivé au pouvoir, il faut reconnaître qu'il a été d'une sagesse extraordinaire. Il a été miséricordieux. Il a accepté d'avaliser ses geôliers, de les nommer à des fonctions éminentes et de montrer qu'il était au-dessus de certaines considérations passionnelles. Et je crois qu'il a forgé le respect dans ce sens-là. Une autre raison, c'est qu'il a accepté de mettre fin à son pouvoir en disant « je fais un mandat et je laisse les autres s'occuper de l'avenir de l'Afrique du Sud ».
Si Mandela était sorti de prison, n'avait pas une conscience élevée de certaines valeurs humaines et voulait remettre en cause tout ce que l'apartheid, tout ce que l'Occident a fait subir à son pays et à son peuple, on ne parlerait pas de lui aujourd'hui. C'est parce que Mandela a permis que le sang ne se verse pas en Afrique du Sud. Mandela a accepté d'aller discuter avec les assassins de Chapelville. Il a accepté de discuter avec les assassins de Soweto. Donc, cela a eu pour conséquence aussi de permettre la garantie ou la sécurisation des biens des Blancs. Parce que c'est ça. Donc, il est bon. Il est bon. On aurait tué 10 100 Blancs. Ce serait le plus grand diable que l'humanité ait eu.
While Mandela is praised, Mugabe is denigrated and treated as a dictator, although he was once considered an ally of the Western countries.
Mais c'est les intérêts, justement. C'est les intérêts qui font ça. Et les chefs d'État qui durent au pouvoir, bien souvent, qu'est-ce qu'ils font? Ils établissent une connivence avec les Occidentaux qui vont cesser de les dépeindre abusivement. Vous pouvez faire la généalogie des chefs d'État qui durent au pouvoir, tous c'est comme cela. Maintenant, quand vous devenez rebelle comme Mugabe, évidemment, ils font maintenant la contre-propagande.
Mugabe wanted to nationalize a lot of land. He wanted the government to seize land, especially after the British refused to provide funds for authentic land reform on a sale of property, private ownership on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. When that money didn't come forward from the British government, and it was clear that the Zimbabwean government was going to have to pay for this, and they didn't have the funds, then Mugabe began to talk about seizures of land, about government seizures of land. Now, the Western countries could not support that, because if they supported a government policy of expropriating private property, it would undermine the very institutions that support those Western countries. And so to support that would have undercut, for example, the whole notion in the United States of private ownership of property, you see. And so Mugabe, by supporting the notion that the government has a right to seize properties, he immediately set himself up as an oppositional figure in the world, in the capitalist world, in the industrialized Western world.
Regardless of this grievance from the Western world, Mugabe still leads his country. And to some Africans, that shows Mugabe is still supported by his people.
Je trouve que sur bien des points, Robert Mugabe n'a pas tort. Sur bien des points, il n'a pas tort. Mais c'est pourquoi d'ailleurs, comme il a quand même une base, c'est ce qui lui permet de résister. Autrement, il y a longtemps qu'il aurait été balayé. C'est vrai qu'il ne peut plus développer son pays pour la simple raison qu'on ne lui facilite pas la tâche. Ça c'est clair, son pays va stagner tant qu'il est là. Mais en même temps, il donne une leçon aux puissants du jour pour dire que chez moi, ceux qui me font, ce sont ceux qui sont là et non pas ceux de l'extérieur.
Compare with other situations in African countries, you find that there are worse dictators who are much more corrupt, much more violent, massive human rights abuse, but they just happen to be allies of the Western countries. In 2005, the International Court of Justice found Uganda liable crimes against humanity and war crimes in Congo. But Uganda remains a big friend of Washington and London, and the ICC investigation has gone nowhere, partly because the ICC is aware of that. London and Washington wants to maintain good relations with Uganda. And that, to me, undermines the credibility of Western media and certainly Western governments. And it also is clear proof to anyone that there is sort of an unwritten collusion between so-called independent Western media, who always, praise themselves about being objective.
The duplicity between Western countries and the media to derogatively depict Africa is purposeful. Some experts say they negatively depict blacks in order to maintain a so-called superiority of whites.
If the media was much more critical and demanding through reporting and editorials, could the U.S. really maintain a good relationship with Mobutu for such a long time? I doubt it. Very critical media. Could Rhodesia have existed for such a long time? Could apartheid have existed for such a long time in South Africa? And today, as I just gave you the example, could the suffering of the people in the Congo continue if there was much more critical media exposing the role of Uganda's army and Rwanda's army and Western companies that benefit from stealing resources from Eastern Congo with much more critical media? Could these things maintain? I doubt it. When media want to do its job, it does very effectively.
Vous savez, il est difficile de s'autodétruire et l'Occident est dans un processus de sauvegarde de civilisation. L'Occident fera tout pour montrer que sa civilisation est la meilleure. Tout simplement parce que l'Occident s'est imposé par la force des choses comme étant le seul modèle qui vaille. Alors, et pour défendre ce modèle, évidemment, l'Occident doit aussi défendre les péchés qui découlent de ce modèle-là. Donc, il y a un masque évident que l'on peut bien comprendre. Donc, c'est d'ordre idéologique, il ne faut pas se leurrer.
On ne cherche plus les causes. Parce que si vous voulez chercher les causes, vous serez obligé d'expliquer l'origine de telle guerre, l'origine de telle pauvreté, l'origine de telle misère. Donc, en ce moment, votre opinion comprendrait que c'est vous qui êtes derrière cela. Donc, ça ne pourra pas passer. Donc, on ne va pas se contenter. On trouve inutile de le présenter puisque on a formaté l'opinion à ce que les Africains sont des grands enfants, sont des grands singes, sont à la limite déjà inutiles, incapables. Donc, c'est cette image qu'il faut donner.
Not only does Western media negatively depict Africa, but they also do not respect some ethical rules when portraying the continent and its people that has been going on for so long.
It interests me because they hung on to these images of Africa long after the Homer bigots of the New York Times left the scene. I mean, I used to marvel at the colleagues that I met from the British press covering the Congo or Nigeria or Ghana. They were almost expected to denigrate what was happening in Africa. They were almost expected to make fun of Africans. They had very cynical attitudes towards Africa. They came there with these cynical attitudes and they looked to confirm them in the course of their reporting. And they also made things up. I mean, the British penny press the Daily Mail, and these papers are perfectly capable of lying and lying and lying and lying and celebrating those lies to sell newspapers.
Il n'y a que lorsqu'il s'agit d'Afrique que vous voyez des médias occidentaux présenter des images de cadavres, etc., etc. Mais quand c'est ailleurs, ils ne le feront jamais.
Le droit à l'image, ça n'existe pas pour les pauvres enfants qu'on montre dans les images pour mobiliser l'aide. Et on les montre sans masquer leur visage. On filme des villageois dans leur intimité et on montre sans rien cacher. Mais on ne peut pas aller filmer des gens comme ça en Occident. Ce que nous savons de l'Amérique, c'est ce que les médias américains nous ont fait voir. Ce que nous savons de l'Europe, c'est ce que les médias européens nous ont fait voir. Mais ce qu'ils savent de nous, c'est ce que leurs médias leur font voir de nous.
If I'm sent to France, there's a certain type of article that is expected from me. If I sent to Russia, there's a certain type of article expected of me. China, same thing. Africa. The Africa template is the template that we need to completely abolish and change.
How to change this situation?
Il faut vraiment avoir un regard particulièrement engagé pour se préoccuper de voir ce qui se bouge en Afrique au lieu de montrer uniquement ce qui ne va pas. Il y a des acteurs de transformation de nos sociétés que vous preniez, que ce soit au niveau scientifique, au niveau économique, au niveau politique, vous pouvez, je postule, dans toutes les sociétés africaines sans exception, trouver des acteurs, aussi bien collectifs qu'individuels, qui vous donnent une image d'une Afrique qui avance, qui triomphe de ses propres limites.
Some Western journalists have failed in presenting Africa as it is.
In some of the books that have been written by American journalists who have worked in Africa, many of them describe their efforts to get certain kinds of stories in, and their editors, their problems they've faced with their editors. And then also by looking at the different journalist accounts, you can tell some journalists are sympathetic with and understand Africa and try to give, the full range of stories, and others share the common stereotypes.
Usually has to do with crises, things not working, conflict. It takes a conscious effort to balance it. I think the tendency of journalists, correspondents in the field is not to worry about whether it's good or bad, that it's news. It's newsier when it's negative.
Do I come out here because I know what my editor wants? So even when I stumble upon a story that's saying something else, do I walk by until I find the one that fits into that template, which demands for a negative story? I think that's the challenge that most Western reporters need to address, and I think they don't, because the editors are not demanding. How many articles that should never have been published, if the editors took Africa seriously, how many are published on a daily basis, even as we speak today? Just based on what I did and saw with my own eyes, the research for my book, I have no doubt at all that many manufactured, concocted articles are still published today about African settings.
If Western media pejoratively present the African continent and its population, one should admit that most of the leaders give that opportunity.
Il faut aussi reconnaître que cette image-là est la résultante des Africains aussi en partie, qui ne donnent pas forcément le bon exemple. La démocratie, qui semble être la valeur dominante en ce début du XXIe siècle, n'est pas très bien partagée dans le continent africain. La conception du pouvoir est assez autocratique, dictatoriale, à la limite patrimoniale, et tout cela fait que l'Afrique ne peut pas avoir une bonne image dans les médias occidentaux.
Nelson Mandela justement disait que l'Afrique n'a pas mal à sa pauvreté. L'Afrique souffre du manque de vision de ses leaders. Un leader qui n'a pas de vision n'est pas un leader. Parce que ce qui définit les leaders, c'est d'abord la vision. Il va plus loin que les autres et bien avant que les autres. Et c'est comment conduire les autres vers le but. Un but commun, mais pas un but individuel.
I'm not the person who's saying, don't write about negative things if they happen in Africa. Of course not. I'm one of the most critical. But it does not mean you need to abuse Africans. You need to distort the coverage. You need to depict them as anybody that is less of a human being than non-Africans. That's where I have my beef. When you write about Russia, when it was Soviet Union was going through the collapse, the changes, they were not depicting Russian people as inferior to other Europeans intellectually or morally or spiritually. You know, even though they had conflicts in Chechnya with some of the worst killings comparable to even some Afghan situations, but yet in those circumstances they always examine the human frailties and failures, but they're depicted as human beings who are going through crises. But when you see Africa as belonging in a different category, not part of the human family, that's where the problem persists.
If Western media present biased views on Africa, the following key question must be raised. Who should be given the voice to tell stories of the continent and its people?
As far as the rest of the world is concerned, is its own worst enemy, because of it has no way of telling its story without being told by a foreigner to his or her newspaper or radio or television station. That's the dilemma. I constantly fought the difficulty of telling what is life like in an African village? What is life like for a university student, for a professor, for the universities as a whole? What's happening in education or not happening in education?
I'm very much against making judgments about who should tell the story based on where they're from. I think one needs lots of different stories, and I think it needs not to be told only by journalists either. Now, obviously, in terms of who should tell African stories, most people who tell African stories should be African, but that doesn't mean other people shouldn't as well. And how well those stories are told and how honest will vary.
En Occident, l'image de l'Occident est construite par les Occidentaux. C'est les journalistes occidentaux qui construisent l'image de l'Occident. Et c'est des images choisies. On ne montre pas n'importe quoi de l'Occident. On montre de l'Occident la part qui fait rêver, la part qui rehausse, la partie de l'Occident qui la met vraiment au diapason, qui le met dans une certaine distance qualitative par rapport aux autres sociétés. Mais qui fait ça? C'est des journalistes. Pas des journalistes africains, c'est des journalistes occidentaux.
How can African countries have media that amplify their own voices and stop the spread of stereotypes about Africa?
Pour corriger tout ça, il faut que l'Afrique travaille à devenir forte, qu'elle travaille à être émergente en termes de valeurs, en termes d'exemplarité, comme l'Asie est en train de le faire aujourd'hui.
Moi, je pense qu'il faut d'abord prendre conscience. Or, beaucoup de gens n'ont pas conscience de ce qui se passe. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, ce qui est en cause, c'est notre identité qui est en train d'être réduite à néant. On nous transforme en quelque chose d'autre, qui n'est pas ce que nous sommes, mais qui n'est pas ce qu'ils sont. C'est une guerre de culture, une guerre ouverte avec des moyens financiers et politiques à travers un système bien établi, connu de tous, mais qui ne souffre pas d'analyse critique.
In the end, Africa is going to have to sort out its own problems with its own governments and its own challenges and try to overcome them themselves. And that they're not going to get help from the West. They're not going to break out of that cycle of bad news is good is news. Trouble equals news.
Une télé comme Al Jazeera est venue en opposition sur des valeurs civilisationnelles, est venue en opposition de l'Occident, donne aujourd'hui une autre vision du monde arabe, donne un traitement de l'information fait par des journalistes arabes et qu'on le veuille ou non aujourd'hui, ce média est aussi fort que CNN. Ce média est aussi fort, sinon même plus fort que Euronews, etc. Donc voilà, il faut que les Africains aussi travaillent et ils en ont les possibilités autant intellectuelles, financières.
While waiting to see African leaders work to make the positive changes on how to disseminate objective images of the continent, the South African 2010 World Cup was an opportunity for Western journalists to appreciate the continent, its realities and people.
I'm originally from Liverpool in England. I've lived in California now for the past 40-something years. There was a lot of negative publicity when South Africa was awarded the World Cup, a lot of it, from all around the world. I had a different feeling. I was actually looking forward to it because I grew up here. I lived here as a little boy. And I thought, oh, it's a chance to go back to South Africa and see what has changed since I grew up here, which was sad to say, in the 1950s and 60s. So
I'd like to think that I was not among the people that really said it's terrible, they won't be able to do it. I did have questions about details, but I always have those questions at any World Cup. I complain about the media buses or the lack of access to players. But I never thought that there were going to be giant earthquakes or mass rampages of craziness going on here.
In terms of the best feeling, I think it's wonderful how terrific Africans and South Africans in particular feel about having pulled this off and having done this successfully so far.
Quand nous organisons ce genre de choses, il y a une âme, il y a de la vie, il y a de la passion. Tous les matchs se sont joués à guichet fermé. Dites-moi combien de Coupes du Monde vous avez vu des matchs qui se jouent à guichet fermé?
The international media coverage of this event, record-breaking TV audiences in every country. The final was the most watched event in Spanish television history. You know, the first day of the tournament you had more internet activity than the election of Barack Obama as US president. The legacy of this tournament is that people could actually see positive images of Africans celebrating the global game. And I think South Africans and Africans being proud hosts of this tournament. And I think you can see the level of infrastructure, the level of the tourism opportunities, the business opportunities.
Never happened before. It was like, you know, when you're getting your first girlfriend, you know, some type of feeling, you don't know exactly, you're excited, you don't know what's going to happen, but you know it's a good day. People who fear that for instance, the base camps for the teams would not be up to standard, or that the stadiums would not be up to FIFA standards, or that the service industry will let them down. Actually, they then became the best ambassadors for this country.
I'm coming back for holiday. The people are so friendly, everybody wants to help you. It's a beautiful country. It's got beautiful places to go on holiday. What we have seen, that's not too much, it's only where our hotels were. We were driving from Joburg to Durban just to see the country, and the Dutch team played there, their first match, and it was incredible.
Given the successful organization of the Games, some guests expect another African country to organize a big worldwide event in the future. More importantly, the FIFA committee that was negatively criticized for awarding the month-long event to South Africa is pleased by how this country has hosted the Games.
South Africa has proven that really they can organize this World Cup. they can organize a free competition. And as I said at the very beginning, it is a question of trust and confidence. And we trusted South Africa, in South Africa, and they can be proud. They can be proud. We in FIFA, we are satisfied.
The Western European, American, North American views, we know how they think and what their pessimism was. But has this changed at all the mindset of Africans of showing that yes, we can, we have, and we will again.
I would not be surprised to see possibly Egypt, possibly Morocco bidding in the future for a World Cup. And I would love to see the Olympic Games in Durban because it's a beautiful place, it's warm, it's friendly. The Olympic Games are in the summer, unlike this, which is in the winter. I think Durban would be a perfect place for the Olympic Games.
In the end, the 2010 World Cup in South Africa showed the world that an African country is capable to effectively organize and host an international event. More similar events will probably change the way Western world sees Africa and its people.
The World Cup was this powerful tool that dealt, I think to a large extent, with this perception that people had about Africa. They landed at OR Tambo Airport, one of the best airports in the world. As they left the airport on a taxi or a bus, they did not come across a lion, they didn't see an elephant. They saw normal people like themselves. We as Africans in South Africa, we can now build on going forward to make sure that the legacy of this World Cup is that the perception of us as a dark, corrupt and disease-ridden continent is dealt with.
What was so difficult for us to be hosting it? I want to see the skeptics. Hello, skeptics from the Western countries. In your face. We did it. South Africa, South Africa. To come together and united we shall stand.